couriers were immediately dispatched to the commandants of all those fortresses with orders to surrender them in their existing condition to the enemy's blockading forces and to return immediately to France with their respective garrisons. It was pointedly observed that the fortresses thus abandoned contained nearly the whole of the artillery composing the defense of those belonging to our ancient limits. It was urged that the inventory taken on the first occupation of those fortresses by the French was still in existence. It was proposed to restore them agreeably to that inventory and accordingly to bring back whatever had been supplied from the interior. No attention, however, was paid to these observations by the provisional government, who insisted that the fortresses should be restored in their existing state. The government extended its liberality so far as to order that the arsenal de Touraine, which was exclusively supplied with the old establishment of Valence, as well as articles which had actually been purchased by France, should be unreservedly given up. Nevertheless, it could not be ignorant of what was about to be restored, since there were regular statements in the War Department which might be communicated on being applied for. It would be doing injustice to M. de Talleyrand to suppose that he was taken by surprise on this occasion by the ministers of foreign powers, or deceived as to the extent of the sacrifice which he allowed to be imposed upon France. He saw clearly that no obstacle stood in the way of peace, and that he was depriving himself of the means of assuming a position between France and the enemy for what resource was left to him after the loss of what might have been made available to support a demand, however trifling its nature. How could M. de Talleyrand take upon himself to conclude this transaction before the king's arrival? On the one hand, there was no necessity for entering into a treaty. On the other, there existed no rational motive to justify the basis upon which the negotiations were carrying on. M. de Talleyrand knew much better than the Comte d'Artois that France could muster more numerous forces than the Allies had yet displayed. Our view, a mere glance at the statements of the Minister of War, would be sufficient to prove this fact. No obstacle any longer opposed their being assembled. They might therefore have been made available to the purpose of concluding the negotiation. On the attentive consideration of the motives which may have induced M. de Talleyrand to open that negotiation instead of postponing it until the king's arrival, one is reluctantly compelled to attach some credit to the rumors which were circulated and which connected the conclusion of the above transaction with the interests of a private nature. I was assured, and this assurance was repeated to me in a well-informed quarter, that M. de Talleyrand, having been compelled by circumstances to work for the return of the Bourbons, felt no confidence in the position which he might have it in his power to assume, as he already entertained some presentiment of the feelings which those princes brought back with them, and as foreseeing no personal advantage in the change, he bent his thoughts to the object of securing to himself an independence which might protect him from the consequence of his falling into disgrace. In a word, he had set his customary engines to work for the purpose of conveying this proposal of an armistice to the foreign powers who had pledged themselves to acknowledge his services to them. How indeed could an act of generosity have been withheld from a man who, by the mere dash of his pen, gave up to foreign sovereigns a materiel of artillery and ammunition in such abundance that the wealthiest power could never have purchased them without a heavy pressure on its finances? However injurious this suspicion may be, it was current at the time. I relate the circumstance such as I heard it from persons who were in the habit of watching and commenting upon M. de Talleyrand's conduct. What peace could remain unconcluded after the signature of that convention? All that was left to be done was to bring together with more or less sagacity certain conditions which serve no longer at the present day as guarantees for the repose of nations, if, as it is possible, M. de Talleyrand entertained any other projects than those in which he had been compelled to participate, he could employ no better means for calming the enthusiasm with which he feared that the king would be received on his return than to reflect a disgrace upon that period of our history by a sacrifice such as that which he allowed to be imposed upon the nation at a moment when she still had it in her power to enforce a respect for what she had acquired at the cost of so many efforts. The king made his entry into Paris on the 21st of April. He had landed at Boulogne and proceeded from thence to Compiègne to which place the provisional government, the ministers, and the marshals of France had repaired in order to present him with their homage and offer him the assurances of their fidelity to his service. The emperor was still at Fontainebleau. It was farther reserved for him to witness the desertion of his standards by those men whom he had reared up and enriched, and who were now rushing forward to secure their share of the new prospects opening to them. Will it be believed that the marshals were headed by that very Berthier who had been so often mentioned in the course of these memoirs? He addressed the king on behalf of the marshals and said that France, having groaned for the last 20 years under the weight of the misfortunes which oppressed her, had looked forward to the happy day which now shone upon her, although not a week had yet elapsed since he promised the Emperor Fontainebleau never to desert him. Could Berthier, his companion in arms, the friend whom he had selected to proceed to Vienna and marry the daughter of the Emperor of Austria in his name, could he so far forget himself? Nevertheless, he was really attached to the sovereign. He was insulting in this manner. He was paying a tribute to his weakness of character and to the delirium of that period, without ceasing to cherish and to pity the benefactor whose misfortune he had not the courage to share. From Compiègne, the king proceeded to Saint-Ouen, which is known to be at a distance of only 2 leagues from Paris. He there received the Senate, which brought to him the constitution lately framed, by means of which it flattered itself with having irrevocably settled its destinies. I have heard some of its members assert that they had scarcely retired from this audience when they foresaw what was about to happen. The cortege, which was to accompany the king on his entry into Paris, was already assembled. He commenced his march and entered by the suburb of Saint-Martin, after having proceeded along the external boulevards. Berthier was before the king's carriage, with several of the marshals, as well as the Duc de Feltre, who had asserted in full council, in presence of the empress, that so long as there remained a single village where the emperor's authority was acknowledged, that village would be the capital at which all Frenchmen ought to meet. I stood in the crowd, a mere spectator of the procession. It no doubt brought some recollections to my mind, but the picture was of the most gloomy description. Had the individuals riding about the king's carriage been those who shared the misfortunes of his exile, nothing could have been more natural. But there was something revolting in the sight of men now following the train of Louis XVIII, who occupied the first places in the emperor's triumphal marches. The king would no doubt have felt greater esteem for those new adherents of legitimacy had they pleaded as an excuse for their non-attendance their age and their fatigues, and condemned themselves to a dignified retirement rather than be guilty of such gratuitous exposure. For, in short, he had not called them to grace his entry, and could not entertain a very exalted opinion of men who acted of so mean a character. Mankind is a compound of weakness, and is at no time proof against too severe a test. Let it never be urged any longer that the emperor derived great assistance from his officers. I do not stand in need of this proof to feel surprised at his having performed such extraordinary feats with the assistance of such men. Such, however, were much less blamable than they were entitled to our pity. They only wanted penetration to discover that they had acted their parts, and that, unless directly called upon, it behooved them to keep at a distance. The people at large, who have a more correct sense of propriety than is generally supposed, were unsparing in their censure of Berthier. I repeatedly heard the crowd cry out to him, "Go to the island of Elba, Berthier! Go to Elba!" It would be an endless work to indulge in all the reflections which might be made respecting the conduct of some of the great personages of the empire. What confidence could they expect the king to entertain in them? What pledges of fidelity did they come to tender? Was it their constancy? The king could form a just estimate of it. Was it a motive of personal interest that brought them to bend the knee to him? They were still more mistaken. Louis XVIII might easily contrast the favors conferred upon them by the sovereign they had deserted with the advantages they might expect from the sovereign to whom they came to pledge their fresh allegiance. The king alighted at Notre Dame, where he felt anxious to return thanks to God for his restoration. The Duchess d'Angoulême sat next to him in a calash drawn by 8 horses belonging to the emperor's stables and led by men who still bore his livery. From Notre Dame, he proceeded to the Tuileries. I pass over the ceremonies customary on such an occasion. They could only be tedious to the reader, added to which I had no longer an opportunity of indulging in personal observations. I have mentioned that it was wholly out of my power to take leave of the emperor previously to his departure for the island of Elba. I now have to explain the facts. Whilst residing at Blois, I received a letter from General Bertrand and wrote to him in reply how painful it was to witness the downfall of the state when there existed so many means of saving it, since the fortress could yet supply a powerful army. I added that if the emperor's forces were not yet adequate to any attempt upon Paris, there should be no hesitation in returning to the banks of the Loire and ordering the armies of Marshal Soult, Suchet, and Augereau to join him in that quarter. I thought we might then be in a condition to try the fortune of war, since the battle fought at the gates of Paris would drive the capital to a state of insurrection, which would never break out as long as the population saw no prospect of the successful issue of such a course. I was therefore from expecting an act of abdication. It unfortunately happened that the only estafette taken between Orléans and Fontainebleau was the very bearer of my letter. I was ignorant of this circumstance when, following the example of the other ministers, I took the road back from Orléans to Paris. M. Molay, the High Judge, whose carriage preceded mine, received on the way a notification transmitted to him from Paris, which he was requested to communicate to me. He was so obliging as to leave one of his servants at the post house who handed me the letter on my arrival. It intimated a request that he would advise me not to go to Paris, as the letter which I had written to General Bertrand on the 8th of April had been seized and communicated to the Emperor of Russia and to the provisional government, who felt highly incensed against me. There was assuredly nothing reprehensible in the suggestion conveyed by my letter. Nevertheless, I availed myself of the advice and returned to Orléans, where I remained 2 days longer, for in the work of revolution 2 days are of consequence. On my return to Paris, I sent a request that M. de Chernicheff, the aide-de-camp of the Emperor of Russia, would favor me with a call. He did so, and consented to ask of his sovereign in my name whether I might live at peace in the bosom of my family and reckon upon his protection in the event of my being molested for acts antecedent to the period when I had to resign my functions. I told Mr. Chernicheff that the moment had arrived when I stood in need of the exercise of those friendly intentions which his sovereign had so often professed towards me during my residence at his court. He returned the same night to intimate to me that the Emperor of Russia would only grant me his protection under the condition of my pledging my word of honor to remain quiet and not to stir a step out of Paris without his leave. I unhesitatingly gave the required pledge. Mr. de Chernicheff added that, as to the effects of the former friendly sentiments to which I had alluded, I ought no longer to rely upon them, because the Emperor Alexander had completely altered his opinion of me. I replied that he could not at least refuse to grant me his esteem, which should amply compensate the loss of the other sentiment. I addressed 2 letters to the Emperor Alexander on this subject, not so much with the view of obtaining any favors from him, as to express my regret at being compelled to acknowledge that the friendly reception he had so frequently given to me had been much rather owing to my public character than to the private esteem with which I thought myself honored on quitting him, since he had himself given me the assurance of it. This step on my part proved unavailing. I could not succeed in overcoming his prejudices, and had to be on my guard. I was a prisoner, though, no doubt, with all Paris for a prison, and it behooved me more than anyone else to act with the utmost circumspection. The Emperor Napoleon appeared surprised at my not going to take leave of him, but he was ignorant of my position in Paris, and when M. de Caulaincourt communicated to me the prince's astonishment, I requested he would make known to him the cause of my absence. Mr. de Caulaincourt rejected my excuse and even urged me to discharge an act of duty. I was well disposed to do so, and requested he would take advantage of his freedom of access to the Emperor Alexander in order to obtain the consent of that sovereign to his taking me to Fontainebleau along with him and bringing me back to Paris. I felt unwilling to expose myself in the event of any disturbance to the accusation of having gone to Fontainebleau for instructions. I observed to him that I should find it sufficiently difficult to avoid being molested without adding fresh embarrassments to the irksomeness of my position, exposed as I was to the resentments inseparable from a spirit of reaction, which was already working its way in every direction. Mr. de Caulaincourt no doubt assigned a different motive to my refusal. This could not surprise me when I found him so strongly persuaded that the recall of the House of Bourbon was the work of a party and the result of a conspiracy. Entertaining such an opinion, he could scarcely avoid suspecting the Minister of Police either of having had some share in the conspiracy or of not having obstructed its progress. It was accordingly natural for him to suppose that this minister's position with the provisional government was already so far settled as to render it unnecessary for him to give any pledges of circumspection in his conduct. It was moreover natural under these circumstances that I should be supposed to have weighty motives for dreading to appear in the emperor's presence. Mr. de Caulaincourt went so far as to tell me that a person who, like myself, was loaded with wealth and honors was always a man of consequence in such a country as France. I attempted in vain to remove his opinions. It was only at a later opinion period that he came to discover the real causes which had brought about the extraordinary catastrophe of the emperor's downfall. Chapter 12. Monsieur Fouché, who had waited in Languedoc and Provence the issue of this lengthened agony, had just arrived in Paris and felt as much surprised as everyone else at the turn which our affairs had taken. This was the first time that anything was done without him. He moved in every direction with a view to be employed, but all the parts were filled up. In vain he presented himself to the Emperor of Russia and the Comte d'Artois, or endeavored to come to an accommodation with Monsieur de Talleyrand. It was too late. He pretended, and his political adherents have joined in the cry that nothing of all this would have happened had he been in Paris. Dupes may have believed him, but those who knew Monsieur Fouché did justice to his real sentiments when they said that the only difference in the aspect of events would have been a capitulation more favorable to his own interests during the stay of the Allied sovereigns in Paris. Many entertainments were given to them. An anxious desire to please them was displayed beyond anything we'd ever seen at Vienna or Berlin. Balls were given at Monsieur de Talleyrand's hotel once or twice a week, and were composed of the handsomest women in the high ranks of society. I do not recollect that any means were omitted of displaying to the utmost the state of degradation into which we had fallen. The Polish ladies had acted very differently when the Austrians entered Warsaw in 1809, and the Emperor of Russia must have perceived that there was no disposition to set Paris on fire with the view of preventing his entrance into that city. He was fond of pleasure, and never failed to partake of those which were thrown in his way. He displayed much gallantry towards the female sex, and was even particularly attentive to some ladies whom he called to visit. As a necessary consequence of the plan of conduct which he had adopted in Paris, he thought himself that he should call upon the Empress Josephine. He was announced at Malmaison and met there all the attentions to which the politeness of his proceeding gave him a claim, but he was mistaken if he supposed that in this retired spot the Emperor's misfortunes were not felt. His visit was accordingly a heart-rending one for Josephine, who endeavored to disguise her feelings in order to give a gracious reception to the man who had just destroyed the peace of her existence. She had Queen Hortense in her company, whose social qualities attracted many people to Malmaison. The Emperor of Russia had heard of this princess and felt some curiosity to become acquainted with her. He almost led me to suppose that he felt anxious to be reconciled to those whose future prospects he had destroyed, but it was impossible to give him an unfriendly reception or to refuse appearing before him, since he had assumed the right to lay down the rules of propriety, and when he could feel no reluctance at coming to display the pomp of his triumph in the midst of his victims, he clearly indicated his expectation of receiving a flattering welcome. The society of Malmaison had so many charms for him that he repeatedly returned to it and requested at last that he might be treated with that degree of familiarity which never compromises the gravity of sovereigns in their intercourse with the fair sex. As the ladies of Malmaison possessed highly cultivated minds, the conversation occasionally dwelt upon topics of a much more serious nature than those which are usually discussed amongst women. The occurrences of the day afforded sufficient matter for discussions, which Queen Hortense was fully competent to keep up. I had the honor of seeing that princess at a later period and expressed to her my opinion as to the cause of our misfortunes, which I exclusively attributed to the Emperor of Russia, without whose intervention nothing could have been effected, because as the chief of that crusade, he had not allowed anything to be undertaken without his previous approbation. Queen Hortense took his part. She had made the same observation to that monarch, and he had insisted in reply that he had not taken any part in the act of dethroning the emperor. My wish was gratified, he said. I also had come to Paris. The emperor was no longer an object of apprehension to me, because an enterprise such as the one to Moscow is never undertaken twice in a man's life. The effect of his resentment could never have reached me. I had accordingly no motive to desire his downfall. This was not the case with my allies, who, being his neighbors, had constantly before their eyes the picture of what had happened to them and what they dreaded might again come to pass. The Emperor of Austria was particularly apprehensive of seeing Napoleon once more in Vienna. The rest were equally alarmed. I could not refuse assent to their wishes, but as for myself personally, I wash my hands of what has been done. Queen Hortense appeared convinced of the truth of these assertions, which she was good enough to repeat to me. For my part, I only saw them in artifice employed to ward off the reproach of a discreditable act so truly unworthy of a mighty sovereign. These assertions aimed at a further object, that of exciting our hatred against Austria and of counteracting the interest shown by everyone for the fate of the Empress Maria Louisa, and interest which the Emperor Alexander began to notice. The Emperor Napoleon's downfall was far too indispensable to the execution of the other projects which he meditated to allow with so favorable an opportunity to escape of destroying the man who might have effectually opposed them. It was consequently of the utmost importance that he should place France at the mercy of England, her most irreconcilable enemy. He consigned to her the task of reducing us to a state of absolute political nullity. Such a course would naturally constitute him the ruler of the whole world. It was easy for the Emperor of Russia to invent whatever he was desirous should be repeated, with the view of guiding public opinion respecting the share he had taken in effecting the Emperor's downfall. By endeavoring to defend his own conduct, he was accusing himself and already admitting that an act of injustice had been performed when he laid it to the charge of his brother sovereigns. This, however, was a direct attempt at imposing upon the credulity of the people at large, for it was quite evident that nothing could have been done without him. I am not quite clear, besides, whether the part to which he laid claim was much more honorable than that which he felt desirous of ascribing to others, whilst the Emperor of Russia was indulging in the enjoyment of balls and inhaling the perfume of adulation which was constantly burning before him. The King of Prussia was engaged in retrieving his affairs, and he acted with judgment in doing so. He disposed of the stores and arsenals, and had the baggage carts of his army loaded with all those articles which we had turned to such little account, whilst our very existence was at stake. Muskets, cannons, caissons, everything was removed to Berlin, and we had richly deserved this mortification. The museum was not touched, but it was clear that all eyes were casting a longing look at the collection. A sufficient motive for decreeing its doom was to be found in the circumstance that it attested the splendor of our renown. An opportunity was anxiously hoped for of returning to it. Fortunately, however, the Emperor's shadow still protected that brilliant collection. France was now reduced to the necessity of relinquishing all she had acquired since 1792, either by right of conquest or in return for compensations which her enemies had obtained in their dealings with her. France alone bore the sacrifices. The other powers resumed what they had lost without ever giving up the compensation they had previously obtained. This was called a restoration of the equilibrium between the different powers of Europe. France was so nearly annihilated that one is at a loss to understand how the government, at whose mercy she was placed by her reverses, could allow matters to be carried to such extremities. Austria was not mistaken in her anticipation of the turn she should give to the general aspect of affairs. It must be acknowledged that she threw herself in a very unreserved manner into the arms of Russia, without foreseeing the consequences of such blind confidence on her part, or deriving a suitable advantages from the weight which her own power had thrown into the scale, or else, ever since the conferences at Prague, she had acquiesced in all the views of the Emperor's personal enemies against the ascendancy of France. Whatever may have been the circumstances which led to the determination adopted by Austria at that period, she will suffer at some future day for the errors of her cabinet, and eventually admit that she merely made an exchange of difficulties with the additional disadvantage for her of losing all the means she had at command and coming to an accommodation with France had circumstances or political considerations required it. The history of all ages is very nearly the same. We are told in the records of the past century that at a time when neither Russia nor Prussia were yet known, Sweden was a first-rate power, as well as Poland and the Ottoman Empire in particular. In those days, the Austrian monarchy deemed her existence sufficiently threatened by the call of a grandson of Louis XIV to the throne of Spain to justify her in embarking in that protracted war which only terminated by the Peace of Utrecht. An equilibrium was then established between the several powers by the dismembering of a great portion of the Spanish monarchy. At the present day, France has been placed in a situation far less advantageous than at that period, already too disastrous, when she was at least afforded the means of afterwards connecting herself with Spain and Holland in order to assert her maritime independence. She could not at present resort to a similar course, since those two countries have, like herself, lost the greater part of their colonies, and yet these are the possessions which constitute a commercial power and afford the means of keeping up a navy. The English, by bringing about this state of things, have secured for a long time their naval superiority, the true secret of their wealth, and consequently of their influence over the rest of the world. It is no doubt certain that America has risen in the scale, but she is also threatened with the danger of acquiring so gigantic a power that she will probably adopt a policy different from that which she has hitherto pursued ever since the peace of 1783, and France, like other nations, will have to apprehend her spirit of rivalry after having looked forward to her assistance. The maritime forces of Europe may at some future day be inadequate to contend with those of the Americas. A country which in that respect possesses local advantages analogous to those wielded by Russia on the continent, however far distant that period may be, it is easy to anticipate its approach, and as the time to which these memoirs apply has been sufficiently painful to warrant our looking into futurity, we are justified in expressing the opinion that, on the score of naval equilibrium, no principle of equity has presided over the partition effected. A mere glance at what has taken place will readily enable us to point at that power which has not only directed everything, but laid down the law with undivided sway. Ever since the beginning of the 17th century, the partitions made at Utrecht had been sanctioned by consideration for the repose of Europe. If the calamities which have since afflicted mankind had tended to the object of establishing an order of things calculated to secure to the world a long enjoyment of peace, the result would have justified the means. The case, however, was otherwise. It must be admitted that what has been done appears to be in manifest opposition to so noble an object. There can be no doubt that the changes which have occurred in the partition of Europe within the last century had also affected its course of policy. Old states had, in fact, disappeared, others had sprung up, and came forward to the work of partition, rounded as they were by the destruction of a variety of nations, for which it never occurred to any power to call them to an account. France alone was made to experience the fate of the ass in the fable of the animals afflicted with the plague. She was condemned by the decision of judges and witnesses who had to answer for at least an equal degree of guilt. Nevertheless, it should be borne in mind that a signal error was committed in not laying all resentment aside, and that the more numerous were the powers who aimed at preponderance on the great scene of the world, the more every act required mature attention. This was the moment, in fact, for keeping all private animosities in check. Prudence, even enjoying the propriety of stifling the spirit of discord, which might again be revived amongst the French in order to force the whole political weight of France into that direction in which it was desirable to apply it. It is a mistaken notion to suppose that in the dismembering of a country, the portions which are joined to various other states carry the same weight in questions of policy as when they belong to a powerful people and were brought in aid of its views. Whatever has been wrested from France for the purpose of enervating her has but slightly augmented the power of those states which have acquired possessions of her provinces. In like manner, neither the provinces possessed by Sweden previously to the fatal Treaty of Neustadt, the Kingdom of Poland, the Turkish Empire and its integrity, the Tartars of Georgia, nor the Persian provinces at the mouths of the Volga in the enjoyment of their independence could endanger the repose of Europe, which had nevertheless the misfortune to remain indifferent to the fate which has successfully befell those several countries. Russia, by subjugating them, unwatched by the rest of Europe, has acquired a powerful, infinitely greater than any other which history records in its annals. To this more than gigantic power is combined the unity of action produced by a despotic government extending its sway over more than 1/4 of the population of the known world and exercising a moral influence over half the remainder. Ever since the restoration of the political equilibrium in Europe, a multitude of people, unknown to her, those who inhabit the immense surface amongst the polar ices which separate the north of America from Russia, and the line drawn up from the mouth of the Vistula across that of the Borysthenes to the mouth of the Volga, besides an extent of country equal to the surface of France, and situated to the westward of those rivers, another still more unknown country on the borders of the Caspian Sea. This multitude of people, I say, are immediate vassals of the same government which acknowledges no other law than its will, is at liberty to raise armies, to wage war, or conclude peace at its own option without any restraint being imposed upon its power by internal institutions. This immense monarchy can therefore keep armies on foot equal to the united forces of the rest of Europe without the knowledge of the latter, because the intercourse with that country merely exists upon a single point, whilst the relations of Russia with Europe are possessed of numberless ramifications. Those armies may be transported to Asia or to the very heart of Europe before any intimation can reach Paris, London, or Vienna. The proceedings she is carrying on. Such is nevertheless the position into which we have involved ourselves by exclusively giving way to feelings of revenge and sacrificing every consideration to the object of gratifying that passion. It is urged as an excuse that the present sovereign of Russia is friendly to peace and will uphold his own work. He is, however, the same monarch who provoked and kindled the War of 1805, the origin of all subsequent wars. Let us admit for a moment that, ripened by age, which confers experience and philosophy, he should be disposed to keep up a spirit of good harmony between those nations of whose destinies he has become the arbiter. Is he gifted with immortality? In the event of his death, what measures have been adopted to keep a young and warlike successor in check? How is it possible to guard against the effects of his ambition in a country which hitherto reckons as many palace revolutions in its annals as regular accessions of monarchs to the throne? We discover in the church of the fortress of St. Petersburg the sepulchral tombs of the 9 or 10 sovereigns who have hitherto swayed the Russian scepter. And Catherine II is almost the only one who died a natural death. Let us suppose, however, that the present sovereign of Russia should feel desirous of maintaining peace, notwithstanding the operations which are yet enjoined to him, with the view of completing that glorious reign and of consolidating a system which he cannot but be aware is already looked upon with a gloomy and restless feeling of uneasiness of his successor, who will not have the advantage of the same moral power over the nation, should be compelled to undertake fresh incursions. What calamities may not fall the rest of the world? What alliance can it be possible to form with the view of resisting the torrent? Prussia will be compelled to follow the policy of Russia in order to maintain her sway over the countries she possesses from Memel to the other side of the Neva, and as far as the mouth of the Vistula. She will compel Saxony to imitate her example, and a great portion of the northern states of Germany will follow the same course. What will Austria, conjointly with Bavaria, have it in her power to effect single-handed? Will she be able to support the Turks and to defend herself at the same time? It would be unreasonable to expect it. Will she call France and Spain to her assistance? They would arrive too late, besides which it is to them of little consequence to whose hands might be consigned the scepter of Bohemian Hungary. They would both have their own burden to carry. This is the only privilege left to them in consequence of the defenseless state to which they have been reduced. If they should allow themselves to be borne away by fair promises, they would fall dupes to the snare. Their better course would be to unite for the purpose of taking part in the spoils of the vanquished, rather than thrust themselves forward to the brunt of the conflict. They have losses to repair and cannot afford to risk anything. The more attentively we consider what Austria has tamely submitted to, the less we can account for her extraordinary policy. If Austria consented at the conferences of Prague to the destruction of France and of her ruler, nothing can excuse so egregious an error. And if we are to suppose that the Emperor of Austria himself has given way to a feeling of resentment which he appeared to have banished ever since the union of his daughter with the Emperor Napoleon, his cabinet should not have allowed him to do more than submit to the sacrifice which affected his personal dignity, but never to which concern the direct interests of his monarchy. The monarch whose hopes had been deceived might have given way to his former animosity, but it behooved the cabinet to be the more prudent, as the head of the state was giving a free loose to sentiments which had the effect of obscuring his judgment. A minister should be inaccessible to every passion because he holds a responsible office and must always be prepared to render an account of the motives which regulated his conduct without urging an excuse that he has been led astray. If the Austrian minister has subscribed at Prague to the downfall of France, he alone is guilty of the consequences that may flow from such a conduct, because his refusal to act would have compelled the adoption of a different basis, which he would be inexcusable not to have presented of his own accord and brought under previous discussion. If the events which followed the entrance of the Allies into Paris in the month of March 1814 have alone imposed upon Austria that character of indifference which she assumed, her cabinet was still more reprehensible, because the course which would have sprung from the dictates of a prudent foresight previously to her embarking in the coalition became an imperative duty when the policy of Russia and of England was developing itself in such a manner as to let Austria discover whether or not she had been led into error, and to make it manifest to her that the hatred of France was again made to turn against her, since her cabinet ought no longer to have doubted of the probable consequence of what was taking place. Chapter 7. Had the cabinet of Austria protested against the issue of this campaign, she would have again placed everything in doubt. Austria would have resumed her rank of mediator of the destinies of Europe by adding to her strength that which was still wielded by France, and which she aimed at combining with the strength to which a protector could lay claim. Austria might have recovered at that moment the character she ought to have assumed at Prague, that of arbiter of France and of Italy besides, whose independence she would have acted much more judiciously in protecting under one or more princes of her house, since the sovereigns had consented one after the other to the ruin of the house of Bourbon in order to favor their own aggrandizement. It would not have been unreasonable in Austria, under such circumstances, to attempt recovering the equivalent of the power wielded by Charles V, at least in his European dominions. She incurred no risk and could only improve her condition, which has been very little benefited by the recovery of her former provinces. They have been too long detached from the mother country to bring back to her any warmth of affection. By protecting the administrative independence of Italy, Austria would have prevented the aggrandizement of her other neighbors, whom she has permitted to make acquisitions infinitely more advantageous than the great part of those she has herself recovered. The proof of this will be found in a comparison of the power wielded by France and Italy previously to 1814 with what might be presented at this day by France, Belgium, the countries along the Rhine which have been bestowed upon various princes, and lastly by Tuscany and Piedmont. The former kingdom of Italy has scarcely added 4 regiments to the Austrian army, and it requires 8 or 10 Austrian regiments to check the spirit of discontent prevailing in that country. Prussia and Russia in particular have made acquisitions which are not attended with similar disadvantages. The latter power, whilst compelling other states to fall back into their old tracks, has not applied the same principle to her own conduct. She has, on the contrary, traced out for herself a new road, by which we may yet see her drawing near to the sun in the midst of the ruins of more than one crumbling nation, and thus bring in her train fresh elements of confusion and scatter them on the scene of Europe. France is the only country against which a fresh crusade would be proclaimed if she merely attempted to recover Landau or repair the fortifications of Hüningen, a mere newspaper paragraph would have been the signal for many battles a few years back, and at the present day the cabinets of Europe are indifferent to every occurrence which is paving the way for the subjugation of the world. It is now asked, where are those statesmen who have been so clamorous in their eagerness to lessen the power of France? And what has been gained towards the repose of Europe by substituting to that power a much more dangerous one, against which there does not even exist the resource of family alliances calculated to resist her attempts at universal dominion? Russia resorted to such alliances in the outset with a view of securing beforehand every advantageous position she could grasp at. We may now contemplate the consequences. On the female side, the Emperor of Russia is one of the pretenders to the crown of Sweden. For if the latter, on the demise of Charles VIII, should fall to the latter Bernadette, it will surely not be handed down to his son. The Emperor of Russia is, moreover, the brother-in-law of the King of Bavaria, of the Grand Duke of Baden, of the hereditary Prince of Hesse-Darmstadt, of the King of Württemberg. Besides being nephew to all the princes of the latter house, he is also brother-in-law to the King of the Low Countries, of the Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, of the hereditary Prince of Saxe-Weimar, who it is well known is the elder branch of the Saxon family, which was only dispossessed of the electorate of that name, the present Kingdom of Saxony, by the power of an emperor of Germany, who placed the elector under the ban of the empire for waging war against him, and had him condemned to resign the electorate to the younger branch of Weimar, which he was forced to effect an exchange. The Emperor of Russia, in short, is the brother-in-law of the hereditary Prince of Prussia, whose sister has just married a Grand Duke of Russia. He is, moreover, allied to the House of Saxe-Coburg by the marriage of his brother, the Grand Duke Constantine, with a princess of that house. Was it possible to derive more signal advantages than Russia has done from her means of forming alliances? Assuredly not. This attitude on her part crowns the labors of Catherine II. Let it be attempted to dethrone any one of those princesses, the power of resistance is at hand. It is proper to remind the reader in this place that at the period when Russia was treating with France upon an unfavorable basis, no such outrage was offered to the princesses of Russian blood whose husbands had declared against us and whose estates might have been rendered available as an indemnity to Prussia in 1807. Austria reckons a greater number of princesses, and especially of princes in the two branches of Lorraine and of Est, than Russia herself could lay claim to in other quarters. They are all of an age to wield any power confided to them, and yet she has by no means derived from this source such signal advantages for her glory and her power as she might have done. They principally hold military employments in the government of provinces, where they have won the affections of the inhabitants. Generally speaking, however, they live so retired that if it were not for the virtues which distinguish the Grand Duke of Tuscany, the existence of his brothers might be doubted. On the other hand, we hear of nothing else in the travels of the Grand Dukes of Russia. If they were merely destined to hold governments in Siberia, on the Caucasus, or at the Kamchatka, they would not be sent on reconnoitering excursions to Paris, London, Vienna, and Berlin. Whatever may be the political reasons which influence the adoption of the course resorted to, it is far more essential to avert its consequences than to seek its origin. It behooves all countries threatened with invasion to anticipate the necessity of forming a common bond of union and to be ready to afford each other a mutual assistance. The French have unquestionably not a word to object to the conditions imposed upon them, nor have they reached the extent of the evils which they hope to avoid by placing themselves at the mercy of their enemies. They will yet have to bear the weight of those powers which have aggrandized their own territories at the expense of France. Such may possibly be the consequence of the error into which they have fallen by throwing the helm overboard in the height of their danger, if such should be the fate reserved for them. If they should yet have to groan under fresh calamities, they will have conferred the right of being told without the smallest party spirit. How could you entertain any doubt of the object contemplated by the Allied powers? When they waged war against you in 1792, they did not aim at wresting away the conquests you had made. They must therefore have meditated to enslave you. And if in consequence of the sanguinary conflicts which took place between that period and the Treaty of Campo Formio, you were not forced to bend under the yoke which was attempted to be imposed upon you, your escape is owing to the circumstance that the immortal campaigns of Italy had deprived your enemies of the power of injuring you and had compelled them to respect the social organization you had recently adopted. To whom are you indebted for the victories which had procured the acknowledgement of your independence? The trumpet of fame will reply, to the emperor. When he took his departure for Egypt, from whence his return appeared impossible, how could you mistake the motive which induced your enemies to fly once more to arms? Can you still have any doubt of the projects at that time meditated by them, or of what must have been your fate had it not been for the Battle of Zurich and the defense of Genoa, which afforded time for the first consul to reorganize the interior of France and proceed to cull the laurels which awaited him at Marengo? In what condition did he find you on his return from Egypt? Compare it with the conditions to which you were restored by him after the treaties of Luneville and Amiens. If you were not made to pass under the yoke at that period, you are indebted for your escape to his having been fortunately brought back to save you a second time from destruction, when he was exclusively engaged in those occupations which were called for by the expedition preparing at Bologna for the purpose of bringing our struggle with England to a close. He could not assuredly be accused of ambition. You must have a full recollection of the circumstances attending the aggression of England and of the wishes uttered by the whole of France for the successes of the emperor, which it encouraged to the attempt of crossing the straits, on the other side of which appeared to exist the only obstacle to the attainment of a profound peace. You can as little have forgotten how he was suddenly compelled to relinquish that project and proceeded all haste to Germany for the purpose of opposing the most disgraceful and most unjust aggression ever recorded in the pages of history, who deserved on this occasion the appellation of ambitious, or at least of agitator of discord, of disturber of the peace. Was it not this very Emperor Alexander whom you have been recently extolling as your deliverer? If you were unable to form a correct judgment of the projects of the coalesced powers against you at that period, the facts revealed by the general-in-chief of the Austrian army, who was deserted by fortune in the field of Ulm, and above all the plans concerted between England and Russia for the purpose of bringing France back to her limits of 1792, plans manifest to all and avowed at that very period, ought to have opened your eyes and clearly demonstrated to you that your internal political organization was the real ground of complaint against you. And if instead of the enemy having dictated conditions to you, you have, on the contrary, hurled back upon themselves the degradation they intended for you, to what cause are you indebted for your success, if not to the Battle of Austerlitz? It was again the emperor who on that occasion extended his shield over France after bringing her triumphant out of the struggle by the power of his mighty genius, when in the following year he conquered at Jena and afterwards at Friedland. Was it not in his power to give way to the allurements of victory? Had he bent his mind to the act of weakness, what could have prevented his performing the part of an ambitious man? Might not the Treaty of Tilsit be opposed to all the reproaches of that description which were leveled at his character? I now come to the enterprise formed against Spain, the only one that public opinion of France has raised her voice to condemn, so far as to ascribe to it all the calamities which have desolated our country. The emperor's projects on the Spanish peninsula were not more ambitious than those of Louis XIV, but the projects of the latter monarch were more skillfully managed. For as to the rights of either upon the country, they consisted in the common interest of the people of both nations, and in the means which both monarchs had at command in their attempt to conquer the obstacles they could not fail to encounter. If, in consequence of the principle which determined Louis XIV to transfer the crown of Spain to his grandson, the emperor could be authorized to undertake the same work, must not be admitted that he had at least seized the most favorable opportunity for carrying his views into effect by obtaining a sanction to those views from the only power that could oppose him, a power whose weight was sufficient to maintain the peace of Europe. What then must be thought of the circumstance that, in despite of the engagements recently entered into with him, the repose pledge to him was allowed to be disturbed, and he was compelled again to resist in haste the aggression to which his allies had already fallen victims in the summer of 1809? Is it reasonable to admit that the enemy who attacked him without any previous declaration were more authorized to feel apprehensions for their own safety than he was justified in the conclusion of their having undertaken this new war merely because they expected that the distance of his army would afford them every facility for revising all their preceding transactions with him? If this be not an unreasonable supposition, it will be less so to point out what would have happened as a consequence of the enemy's success if the campaign of 1809 had terminated in their favor. Now, what is the event of that scientific campaign which again bereft them of the power of injuring us? The Battle of Wagram,